Good evening. As the director and CEO of the Newark Museum of Art, it is my honor and a pleasure to close out the final night of our first, but certainly not last, Racial and Gender Equity Summit. Before we get started, I want to thank again our underwriters, Bristol Myers Squibb, and the New Jersey Council of the Humanities, with additional support provided by Mayor Raz Baraka, Senator Cory Booker, the City of Newark, and the New Jersey State Council of the Arts. The responsibilities of museums are changing because our communities are demanding we do so if we are to remain relevant. The Newark Museum of Art is committed to being part of this dynamic transformation in three ways. First, by emphasizing progressive thought leadership. The second, by becoming a deeper partner to our community. And third, using our privilege to raise up diverse voices, we will redefine what the public can expect from their cultural institution and from each other. Of course, none of this is simple, and all of it makes for some uncomfortable conversations. Unfortunately, these awkward and sometimes even painful exchanges are more critical than ever. The ever-widening gaps in access, from everything to basic health care, to clean drinking water, to safe, nurturing childcare, to equal lending practices, is just plain exhausting for anyone of color. And these discrepancies hurt everyone seeking to live in a just, fair, and advancing society. Over the previous two evenings, though, I have been encouraged and uplifted by our moderators and panelists who have given me and our attendees the promise of greater empathy and the possibility of real change. As we close out the Moral Pandemic Summit, I want to introduce our most challenging and provocative panel of the series. Tonight, we will tackle the subject of white supremacy and white privilege, and the concept of how two belief systems are not often explored together, but they should be. With our panelists, we will discuss how this intersection stems from a social system where a sense of privilege is partially rooted in an artificial sense of superiority. Moderated by John Graham. Mr. John Graham is a double alumnus of the oldest granting HBCU, Lincoln University, and a leading diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. John is also the author of the recently published Plantation Theory, The Black Professional Struggle Between Freedom and Security. In his book, John asks whether it is possible for Black professionals to advance and maintain authenticity. He also explores the role and responsibility of those with power and privilege. With John's credentials, insights, and unique perspective, we are delighted to have him join us this evening. I will now hand over our program to John's incredibly capable hands and leave it to him to introduce his esteemed panelists. Thank you again for joining us tonight. John?
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. What an honor I have this evening to be hosting this conversation, moderating this conversation with some of the most brilliant minds on the topic. And I will get to, I'll get to their introductions in just a moment, have them introduce themselves. What I also want to suggest and welcome to those who are joining us. This conversation, as you've seen by the title, will delve into some very uncomfortable topics. It will challenge core identities and beliefs. And if we've done our jobs right, then those things should be equally true. I also want to open with a couple of quotes, and then we will go ahead and get this show rolling. But first quote, "It's not knowledge we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions." Sven Lindqvist, author of Exterminate All the Brutes. Second quote, "Europeans started mistaking military superiority for intellectual and even biological superiority. And that's when things turn nasty." Also Sven Lindqvist. I want to set the tone here for an amazing conversation, but first I'd love to have our panelists introduce themselves. Let's start with Peggy McIntosh, please. Oh. Well, Peggy, let's get you off mute.
Okay.
There we are.
I like your idea of having self-introductions. Yeah. We were told that on previous evenings, the introductions have been super short, and we were invited to expand a little time-wise. So I'll say maybe 8 sentences.
Okay.
It was leading a seminar on the subject of bringing materials on women into the liberal arts curriculum that I discovered male privilege in a very clear form. Men blocked our bringing women into the curriculum, not because they were not nice men, but because they were very good students of what they'd been taught, which is men have knowledge, men make more knowledge, men publish and profess knowledge, and men are knowers, and knowledge itself is male. And I saw that they had been very good students of this, as I had been too, in the institutions I had attended. And once I discovered that, I thought niceness had nothing to do with it. Then I was stuck. I didn't know what to do next, but the Black women outside of Boston in the suburbs writing the Combahee Women's Collective, the manifesto by Black women, I thought I recognized myself the way I was now recognizing the men, that niceness had nothing to do with it. But I had been taught and had drunk in the idea that whites have knowledge, whites make more knowledge, whites publish and profess knowledge. And we have taken in that knowledge itself is white and that whites are knowers. And does that make us oppressive to work with? I dithered over that for a couple of years. I hoped I'd been so nice that my whiteness hadn't shown. And finally I decided, yes, it showed. It showed. Of course, my Black colleagues saw it. It is oppressive to be dealing with people who have governed knowledge without knowing that they're doing so. So in '88, I wrote White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and blessings on all the teachers who have assigned that to students. And students like it because it's so brief. And I also think they like it because it's autobiographical. The short version has only 26 examples of the ways in which I felt I had unearned advantage by contrast with the 6 Black women in my building at Wellesley Centers for Women. So I still work there after 40 years. And on the basis of that kind of insight, I founded the National Seed Project on Inclusive Curriculum in an effort to repair the damage done by an all-white syllabus, all-white teachers, all-white assumptions. And Emily Stile of New Jersey co-directed Seed with me for the first 35 years, and it is still thriving. And I grew up in New Jersey. Radburn, which was a socialist experimental community, then Ridgewood, then Summit, then Locust. So my schooling in whiteness began in New Jersey.
Fantastic. Peggy, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to kick it over to Patience, if I may. Patience, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you so much, John. And it's an incredible honor for me to be on this panel tonight. And yeah, I was also sort of reflecting about how do I introduce myself, right, on this panel. And I think I'll just say a couple of really brief things. The first one is that I'm the executive director for diversity and inclusive culture at Drexel, where a lot of the work, as you might imagine, on a day-to-day, especially today and after the murder of George Floyd last year, we're really in the midst, and we're in a city of Philadelphia. We're really in the midst of racial injustice and really having to grapple with it for what it is. And so this was part of the reason why I was excited. I don't know that excited is the right word, but that I was looking forward to being on this panel. And I also, because I am familiar with your work, Peggy, that was also another motivation for my wanting to be on the panel. The other thing that I also want to say is sort of situate myself in terms of how I'm entering this conversation. I said I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that is something that I had to interrogate within myself as a Black woman, because I questioned whether my identity might get in the way of the work. After all, there have been so many who look like me, who have been doing this work for so long, yet the needle doesn't move as fast. So what is it about injustices, right? Racial, gender, ethnic, like the multiple layers of them that folks like me haven't been able to really move that. And do people look at me and go, well, here we go, another Black woman talking about diversity. So I had to interrogate that. The other piece is that I am from Cameroon, and I am a native of Com. And so I am an immigrant to this country, which means for the first 18 years of my life, I didn't see myself in racial terms. I knew that I was Black. I knew I lived as a Black person, but that did not inform my lived experience. It wasn't until at the age of 23 when I moved to the United States. In between, I lived in Germany, didn't quite experience my Blackness in the way that I have since moving to the United States and attending an HBCU in Knoxville, Tennessee, and then going from there to University of Pennsylvania. Also having my entry into the United States be through the military because my guardian. So I have multiple layers of sort of how nuanced this conversation can be, both by way of having been born and raised in Cameroon, having grown up in Germany, and now living here. And so I look forward to bringing all of those perspectives, of course, in addition to my own formal training on the topic.
Fantastic to have you. Absolute pleasure. I can't wait to hear the wealth of lived experience lenses that come to this conversation. Patience, thank you. All right, Noor, kick it over to you, please.
All right, perfect. So I'm Noor Kiteli. I am a professor of management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. My training is actually in social psychology. So I got my PhD in social psychology at Harvard. And my research is actually focused on intergroup hierarchies. So in my research, I've been interested in the notable fact that pretty much societies all over the world are structured in the form of group-based dominance hierarchies, where you have some groups that are sitting at the top of the hierarchy with more power, privilege, and resources, and other groups at the bottom of the hierarchy languishing relatively without. My interest in this topic and how these hierarchies are maintained through legitimizing ideologies like racism and dehumanization is, like Patience, in part through some degree of lived experience. So I'm an Arab, and I spent time in the Middle East, in Lebanon. I also spent time in Cyprus, which was also divided by conflict and power hierarchies. And then I went to my undergraduate in Canada, where I also got to witness some conflict between Anglophones and Francophones. So I always joke with my negotiation classes that I became so interested in conflict resolution, partly because I couldn't escape it. But there's some really interesting, I think, linkages between some of the lived experiences that I've had and some of what I've seen in the United States in terms of power and dominance hierarchies as well.
Thank you for that. And I can't wait to dig into some of the research that you've been a part of and have seen as well. So thank you for joining us. Last but certainly not least, Mr. Cornell William Brooks.
Well, first, let me just begin with a word of appreciation to moderator, director of the museum, and certainly all the panelists and everyone in the audience. I mean, I come to this conversation on white supremacy and white privilege as a fourth generation minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a civil rights lawyer, and a person of faith, and someone who I spent my entire adult life grappling with these issues. So by way of background, I'm particularly honored and delighted to be in this conversation with the Newark Museum, having spent 7 years as the president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice in downtown Newark. And thereafter, I went and served as president and CEO of the NAACP, spent the previous 20 years leading civil rights organizations, litigating cases at the Department of Justice. And by way of background or preparation for this work, I too am an HBCU grad, Jackson State in Jackson, Mississippi. And then I went to Boston University School of Theology as a Martin Luther King scholar, because I was really inspired by his moral legacy, and then ultimately Yale Law School. But where I am today is at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I teach advocacy, social justice advocacy, civil rights advocacy, and I serve as visiting professor at the Harvard Divinity School. But all of that to say, the fire in my belly that I had as a semi-radical, angry 18, 19-year-old has not been quenched, has not gone out in all these years. And I suspect by the end of this conversation, I might be more aflame. So I'm just delighted to be here and looking forward to learning from my co-panelists.
Thank you so much for that. And if we do it well together, I believe we should all be fired up. So, and those in the audience as well. So I want to jump in. Before I do, I'm going to kick our first question over to Patience to get this conversation going, but I wanted to ground us in a thought. The title, as everybody's seeing, is White Supremacy versus White Privilege. Where do they intersect? Those that know me know that I don't use the term white supremacy. I use the term white insecurity, mainly because it's more historically accurate than supremacy. And why I say that, just to ground terms, and you might hear this term white insecurity tossed around this evening, but the rooting of that is, if you look at the foundations of colonialism, the impetus was based on resource insecurity, land insecurity, religious insecurity, health insecurity with plagues, food insecurity for sure. And then looking around the other regions where there were trade partnerships or relationships and seeing where all of these resources were coming from that weren't in Europe, there was an agreement made by, first and foremost, the church to go out and secure these resources and introduce religion and expand empire. Fast forward, everything that's been propped up to build the construct that we live in today, where most people see white supremacy, is based on protecting or covering the insecurities, whether it's in your daily interactions in work environments or whether it's in the streets and engaging with law enforcement. There are numerous examples of how that comes up. So I want us to think about that term, and we'll touch on it again as we move forward. But without further ado, Patience, I wanted to ask, we had a really good conversation offline about white supremacy and privilege, and I wanted you to just take some time to unpack that a little bit for the audience. Just what does white supremacy and white privilege mean to you? And if you can share any examples of it existing in real time, would be great.
So actually, just that opening that you gave, kind of like, I'm like, my mind is going in multiple directions in terms of sort of where we might take that conversation. And I believe Peggy mentioned earlier that could be an entire panel of its own. And so I'm going to resist the urge. But one of the things that I wanted to say is really when we talk about, especially when we hear white supremacy at first, right? It's like, I think it is a term that sounds like it's accusing, and then there is a need to defend oneself from it. And so typically, if it's coming from people of color or allies of people of color, and then you have white people retreating into a defensive stance, which is consistent with what Peggy was talking about relative to this nice white person. And basically, at least, you know, like historically, white supremacy is establishing that racial hierarchy that positions white people at the top of it. And so that lighter is, you know, better, according to sort of that line of thinking and way of thinking. And what has happened throughout history is that we've gone from a time where white supremacy, especially if we're looking at it in terms of the context of this country, the other thing that it is important to do is to unpack sort of how it impacts different groups of people of color. So for instance, I said we talk a lot about, especially in the last year, we've been having a lot more conversations about race, but that it is important to understand that when we're talking about Black people, which if we're looking at that racial hierarchy and the systems that are constructed to perpetuate that narrative, when we're looking at that racial hierarchy, it positions Black people at the bottom of it. And it goes back to slavery, but it continues on to today, right? And then when we're looking at it in the context of Native Americans, there's this theme of colonialism that then comes into it, and a disappearing of that history. We're gonna make your story secondary. You're attacking us, the British who are coming in to take over your land. And so now we can control that narrative and position you as a villain and ultimately begin disappearing sort of your own story in that narrative. Then when we look at Asians, it's more this sort of like war, like you're a permanent foreign threat. And so you're someone to be taken care of. And what connects all of these, and then what that also does is that it creates these tensions among people of color, that sort of divide and conquer narrative. And so that when we talk about white supremacy, instantly people are going back to slavery, they're going back to genocide, they're going back to the wars. And you know, as history evolves, people are thinking about the KKK, they're thinking about the killing of Jewish people. You know, they're not connecting it to sort of how it manifests in our day-to-day. I like what one white woman shared in one of Lee Monroe's diversity training, which is really that it's not that people tell me as a white woman that I am better, is that they tell me everyone else is not as good. And people find, and things are pointed out by white people. Like if I said, oh, that's a bad neighborhood, don't go there. Oh, don't study with this person, don't hang out with this person. All of those messages, and then you see the news and you begin to internalize that you are better because after all, everything that you say is better. And so the connection then from that superiority to white privilege is that it gives you access, right? It does benefit you in some ways where you get to catch a break in life. And so I think part of the reason why oftentimes we don't advance that conversation on privilege is that we also in some ways position whiteness as the ultimate privilege and not quite exploring the dynamics of power and access and sort of what it means in that context. And so when we send that narrative and you have a white man who's saying, you know, I grew up poor, I earned everything. Then and then they're pointing out, oh, well, we elected a Black president. We have, and so it becomes a really interesting conversation to be able to engage in, not recognizing that there are many things, or that even society was built with that whiteness and the needs of white people as a group, particularly in the context of this country, with white people at heart. And so everyone else now has to conform. And then we perpetuate the narrative about, well, it's a melting pot. Well, melting to whose pot, and who chooses the ingredients, and who gets to decide, right? Should it be more of a salad bowl or a stir fry, where people can still maintain sort of their identities as a part of that? But that this idea really of white supremacy and white privilege, they're connected, because on the one hand, you're telling someone that they're superior because of their race. And then on the other hand, they get to benefit from the way our systems and structures are set up because of that, ascribed superiority that they have based on their race. And the unfortunate thing, and I'll say this and I'll stop, that the unfortunate thing there too is that as people of color, I talked about those three pillars, we begin to internalize it. And we see it even in our communities, right? Sort of how we begin to look at light and dark. And then even when you gain access to the top of that pyramid, because it's so scarce, how, sometimes that we also continue to perpetuate some of these systems of oppression that are built on white supremacy.
Yes, colorism. For sure, that's something we should certainly spend some time on this evening. I want to open this up before I go into another question. Anybody want to react, respond, or add on to that, to what Patience was saying? No? All right.
Well, I would just add one thing, John. I think one thing that Patience said that really stands out to me is this notion that, the group at the top of a hierarchy gets to decide and institute the standards against which superiority is evaluated in the first place. And it's really easy for us all to imbibe unthinkingly. And I think this gets back to something that Peggy was mentioning earlier, those standards, right? We internalize them. If we're taught that XYZ is what meritocracy or what merit actually is, this is what we should achieve, this is the structure that we're all trying to ascend, then whether we recognize it or not, we're actually being shaped by the dominant narratives. And those dominant narratives are structured in ways that are preordained to advantage the group that set them, right? And that ends up sort of reinforcing that hierarchy. So I think that's a really important point.
Super important point. Please.
Yeah. So I love the framing here, because when we think about white supremacy, superiority, but whiteness as being normative, right? So whiteness as normative is not only credentializing and accrediting, but it is also implicitly and subtly discrediting, right? So in other words, the ways in which whiteness defines intelligence, whiteness defines beauty, whiteness defines authority. There are also ways in which blackness, brownness, color defines the lack of authority, lack of truthfulness, the lack of credibility. That plays itself out in so many ways in the criminal legal system, right? So in other words, when we look at Black children who are perceived as being older, more culpable, more responsible in terms of simply childish behavior, it's interpreted as criminal behavior. So in other words, whiteness is normative, has real world effects on little kids, right? And when Black girls are seen as more mature, more sexualized children, they are then ushered into this brutally efficient school to prison pipeline. So in other words, this whole notion of whiteness is normative is not some abstract philosophical entity, but something that operates in ways that literally impacts children in Newark, children across New Jersey. And so I just wanted to lift that up, that this is just a practical and pragmatic and political consequence for people.
100%. And I also hear, the normative of innocence, trustworthiness, purity.
That's right.
Right? These are all
That's right.
underlying baked in notions into the construct, which then allows for benefit of the doubt when we're talking about sentencing, or even whether there's an arrest made, right? Boys will be boys. They're just kids. They're young, right? We don't want to mess up their futures.
That's right.
But that same assumption or those same allowances are not made for those not in the power structure. Excellent points. I wonder, and Patience, you mentioned proximity, right? The closer you get to power structure, whether resemblance in physical features or phenotypical features, I wonder how that plays into those who are not visibly white, the proximity to power. What does that do to the dynamic within non-white communities, right? As you think about access, as you think about excellence or ascension, rising up, what kind of effects can that have?
I think,
Well, I think your own book.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Peggy.
Peggy, please.
I think your own book talks about the terrible pull toward assimilation, which then may cost you your integrity unless you settle for the idea, which I do like, which is that we all have multiple selves within us. So that assimilation can be learning the rules to help you make a living without necessarily destroying your integrity. If you accept the model that your integrity is made up of plural personalities, adaptations to the worlds you've been in.
Is that something that even white power structure has to wrestle with?
Sure.
These plural identities?
Well, as a female, I had to decide how much to do it Harvard's way. All white curricula, all white teachers, all white assumptions about excellence. What would I do? I decided, well, with a corner of myself, I would work very hard to do as well as possible in that system. And then I went into things that throw it over: women's studies, multicultural studies, GLBT studies, international studies, Black studies. It all put the Harvard curriculum into its rightful particularity, white patriarchal curriculum, and heteronormative as well. And Harvard just gave me an award, astonishingly, at the age of 86. I thought I had left behind Harvard's way of thinking and being. And guess what? They just gave me a Centennial Award, one of 4 each year. Why? Because of the white privilege work and starting the SEED project. And so even Harvard can make more than the assimilative women feel honored.
Well, congratulations on that award.
Yeah, congratulations on that. And I think the problem that I see, it's that as we were talking about that pyramid where a few get to choose and decide how everyone else lives, the problem is not that so much, to your question, John, about for people of color, it's not so much that that you're integrating. I think the problem is the terms by which you're integrating. And so if we're renegotiating the norms in ways that represent the voices, particularly marginalized voices, and having marginalized voices as part of renegotiating those norms, then we're creating a system that works for all of us. But until it's just a few at the top and the message continues to be, well, now you've gained access. And so welcome to the club. And you can also decide how much gatekeeping you do to determine who else comes, right? And it's really subtle. I will say, and there's some, when we're talking about race, we'll talk about the model minority myth as well, right? Where it's like some minorities are better because after all, they listen and pay, particularly people of Asian descent. And I have experienced, having lived in multiple places. First of all, this is my demeanor, where even, I get fired up and a lot of times I have to say, okay, I'm really angry right now. So where people are waiting for some manifestation and I'm like, it's not coming, particularly as a Black woman. So that has afforded me the luxury where I can pretty much say anything to anybody and get away with it. And sometimes people will use that. So it's really subtle, that club membership acceptance. But you're different. And then it's so easy to fall into but what do you mean by I am different? Are you saying because I'm not portraying your stereotype of what you expected me as a Black woman to be, that I am different? Are you saying because of, but that subtlety, and I've heard it particularly from white people when I lived in Germany, when I live here, you're sort of like the safe Black person for me to explore my whiteness around, so that I can say some of these things that I typically wouldn't say to other Black people because you're different. And so then I'm like, oh, you stepped on the wrong one now, because we're really going to go in, right? Like, I welcome it. What course do you want right now? But I think it is important that we're also vigilant in how, again, it's very subtle manifestations in ways that we then become, part of that system and part of that structure that then decides who gains access to that club. Because after all, it's only for a very few. And we want to count how many Black people we want to let in, or how many other people of color we want to let in, so we can point to them, as opposed to getting to that critical mass where we're renegotiating the norms by which we engage with one another.
I couldn't agree more. And to that point, and we're talking about structure. Cornell, I've got a question for you. So, being an HBCU alum, Jackson State, Mississippi, no less, and then going into an HWI, historically white institution, and then rising through the ranks through hard work, law degree, Yale at a pedigreed institution, heading up the NAACP, one of the nation's oldest social justice organizations, and even government work with the FTC. You've been in rooms where privilege and power interplay and seen the subtleties and even the overt expressions of it. Give us a sense of how privilege plays out. Sometimes people might think of it as, whatever they might think about it, but how does it truly play out, especially around power, where decisions are made from lots of people with lots of impact?
So privilege is subtle in its assumption. In other words, the way people own it. It can be subtle, but it can be brutally explicit in its expression in terms of power. And so you rattle off a number of institutions where I have spent time. An HBCU, Boston University, Yale, the Justice Department. But, I've spent time in the White House and Congress, and particularly at the NAACP, in the company of CEOs of some of the largest companies in the country. Privilege plays out this way. When you head up a Black organization, you have an Ivy League pedigree. As patience is lifted up, you've been deemed the respectable and acceptable Black person. You have been afforded and accorded honorary white status for as long as we allow you to have it. And so what that means is an awareness that you can lift up the claims, the concerns of the people that you represent, but there's always an awareness that there's a time limit, right? So in other words, this can be revoked at any moment. And it's not just merely the revocation in terms of your invitation to be in the room, but also revocation of credibility, revocation of legitimacy, revocation of standing. Now, what implications does that have for rank and file folks, right? What this means is that we, as a country, choose between perfect and imperfect victims. Here's what I mean.
Mhm.
Some Black folk exist on the margins of white privilege as a consequence of complexion, pedigree, background. So, concrete example from history. We look at Rosa Parks, right? An assumed demure, light-skinned Black woman whom we chose to be the mother of the civil rights movement. Claudette Colvin, who sat down on a bus, proximate in time, only a little while before Rosa Parks, a darker-skinned, young Black woman whom, if she were around in 2021, she would be the prototype, the face of the Black Lives Matter movement. The point being here is this is a matter of privilege. And so what I'm trying to lift up is that I've been very much aware all my life that I'm on the periphery of white privilege. Let me give you an example. How does a young man go to the Justice Department, the Housing and Civil Rights Division, and work for Deval Patrick, right? That was one of my first jobs out of law school. But when I discovered in the Civil Rights Division was that there were a handful of Black folk in the Civil Rights Division, and nearly all of them were credentialed with Ivy League degrees, right? How is it I was the first Black clerk for my Judge Sam J. Ervin, the son of Senator Sam J. Ervin, author of the Southern Manifesto, his first Black clerk on a court, the most diverse U.S. Court of Appeals court in the country, meaning diversity with respect to the number of Black folks within the district, right? But on that court, there were no women. There were no Blacks. There were no Asians. There were no Latinos. All white men with nearly all white clerks writing opinions on racial profiling, writing opinions on desegregation. Again, I was very much aware, as somebody who was on the Yale Law Journal, graduate of Yale Law School, like Negro, Negro, you've been blessed with some white privilege here, or some the drippings,
Mhm.
of proximity, if you will, to white privilege. So what I'm sharing with you here is that this produces divisions within our community. Like, some people begin to assume that the racial privilege that they've been accorded makes them better, separates them from. And the last point I'll simply make here is this. When it comes to building coalitions within our community, this kind of racial exceptionalism undercuts our efforts to build broad-based movements and coalitions, not with other people, but among us.
That's right. That's right. It's a very, very insightful share there. And I think when we talk about community and the ability to create community, and not just proximity to where you live, but the ideal of shared values, core beliefs, accountability measures within the group, those divides make it much harder to assemble as a unit, right? And that has implications politically in all facets of society. But speaking of that, and Nora, I want to switch gears a little bit and dig into some of the psychology, some of the construction around the behavior patterns of power and privilege, and what you've seen in this work. And I know you've done extensive work in not only in research but also experiments and papers and so forth. So I would love to dig into this as we think about some of the studies and the experiments that you've seen around social hierarchies and so forth. Dig into that if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, for sure. And in fact, I think it sort of dovetails really nicely with some of what's already been said and some of what Cornell was just talking about. One of the things that I opened with is the fact that these systems of hierarchy and stratification are really a human universal, right? The research shows that any society that has any form of economic surplus starts to organize in this hierarchical fashion. And one of the most insightful findings, in my view, from some of the research on psychology of power is that basically, even take away the specific group memberships, the very structural position that groups might occupy either at the top or the bottom of the hierarchy matter. So one of my favorite studies on this is a study where researchers actually brought participants into the lab and they just divided them into groups that were sort of what are called minimal groups. They're not really based on anything. You might think of them as the red t-shirt group and the blue t-shirt group. And what the researchers then do is they create a status hierarchy. They say, you know what, the red t-shirts, you guys are going to be in charge here. You're the group that has power. And the blue t-shirts, you guys are going to take orders from the red t-shirt group. And then they measure blood pressure. And the reason they're measuring blood pressure is because it's an indicator of physiological threat. And what you find is that when you do the original status assignment, when you put the blue t-shirt group at the bottom of the hierarchy, they actually show an increase in blood pressure, right? Being assigned the subordinate role actually is psychologically and even psychophysiologically threatening. And the red t-shirt group that's at the top of the hierarchy, well, they don't show any rise in blood pressure. And then you have the experiment go on for some while. And at some point in the experiment, the researcher introduces the possibility of a revision to the status hierarchy. They say, you know what, we're going to do a task now. And on the basis of this task, we might actually reshuffle your red t-shirts and your blue t-shirts. And then they measure blood pressure again. And now what do you see? You see that the groups that were at the top, the red t-shirt group, now they show the rise in blood pressure because now they're threatened and the possibility of losing power. Whereas the blue t-shirt group, who now has the potential to rise in the status hierarchy, they no longer show any peaks in blood pressure because, you know, it's actually the possibility of a reward. And what I think this is, the reason I bring up this example is because I think it highlights what is essentially a human universal, our status motives and our group-based status motives. Power is rewarding. Groups enjoy that stratification. To go back to what was just being described earlier, you know, when you're invited into that high power club, you're not invited to it rules free. You're sort of basically told, you can join this group that stratifies itself separately from those beneath us. But if you're going to join this club, you have to be watchful of what you are and aren't allowed to say, right? Whether that be the credentialing, whether that be, you know, the statements, who gets invited to speak, who gets invited and promoted and celebrated. Well, it's really the people that are playing by the rules. And, you know, to what we were describing earlier, who sets the rules? It's the groups in power. And the groups in power, for the reason that I mentioned, which is that, you know, they like the status and they're threatened by the loss of it, tend to structure those rules in ways that reinforce, you know, the red t-shirts at the top of the hierarchy.
This is fascinating, and I have so many questions, but as a student of history, I have to ask, and I don't know how far back the research goes, especially around threat perception and the physiological impacts of that, but when you look at civilizations throughout history that have been dominant, right, pre-colonization, and you have to wonder, well, how does this flip, right? How do you see a paradigm shift so massive, right, in such a short period of time? If we're looking at the arc of history, right, European dominance is relatively short on that timeline. When we think about those who were in power, I have to believe they didn't perceive a threat at some point, right? Like at some point, they never saw a threat to their position of power at a global scale, right? Resource wealthy, you know, militarily sound, had traveled, had been around the world, right? All of these things. So I wonder if there is a geographical, if there is a cultural difference in perception of power.
Well, part of it I actually think has to do with the construction of human societies, right? So as you go sort of prior to colonialism, you know, and if you go far enough back in history, you know, human societies were more hunter-gatherer societies where you lacked the accumulation of those economic resources that I mentioned, or that surplus of economic resources that I mentioned was so critical to social stratification. I mean, it was really in part as we shifted from hunter-gatherer type societies to more farming type societies where you can actually fortify, you can actually create divisions of roles and division of labor and social stratification an accumulation of resources in a way that wasn't always as true in our hunter-gatherer bands, that you started to see more of this type of hierarchical thinking. So I think that's one component of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And digging into the studies of Africa pre-colonization, you see that stratification was there thousands and thousands of years prior, but yet sort of that scarcity mindset didn't activate certain behaviors globally, which is very interesting. I appreciate that. I want to throw, Peggy, I want to come back to a concept, something that we've talked about online, and it's interesting based on Nora's highlight of sort of the biological imperatives and impacts. But offline, we talked about, white supremacy, white privilege, but then there's another thing at play that you've mentioned. I'd love for you to dig into that for our audience tonight. I believe white control, I believe it was.
White control. Before we leave Noor out, I want to say, I think it's very useful, Noor, to have all these power dynamics studied in school. And I notice that power is a rather taboo subject in even in political science. And it won't, so I think children are raised not to inquire about how power is working in their own context, at home, on the streets, in school. It's very embarrassing to school scholars and teachers to have their power structures analyzed. But I think you're doing very good work in bringing the subject of power into focus. I taught 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th graders, as well as college kids. I think that certainly by 6th grade, the kids are ready for more discussion of power and how it works than they have been given. Well, I was disconcerted to find that many people were using interchangeably the phrase white privilege and white supremacy. Back when I wrote on a privilege at first, nobody was confusing those two words. Now I think those two phrases are quite often confused. I think of white privilege as passive. I think of white supremacy as active. I think white privilege is a state you're born into by accident of birth. You're born into a culture that favors whites. And then that fills your life with advantages that you didn't earn, didn't ask for, shouldn't be blamed for, but it makes you dangerous to democracy, to be born white in a culture that favors your group. White supremacy, on the other hand, is very intentional. The people who stormed the Capitol weren't doing it because they were feeling anything but anger and righteousness and violence. That's what they were after. And I think it's sentimental to imply that the right, it has a version of whiteness going on that is simply undangerous.
Please go ahead.
So for me, you have to devise and act on white privilege if you're a white supremacist, and you exclude people, you murder people, you block people, you take advantage of people, you impoverish people. With white privilege, it's mostly oblivion. You're born, I was born into, well, first Brooklyn, New York, then Radburn, Ridgewood, Summit, Locust, into New Jersey, places in which whites didn't know that they were white. To be enjoying, so my original list of 46 examples of my white skin privilege was a list of things I was ignorant of. The right wing's white supremacists are not ignorant of what they're doing. They're inflicting harm as much as they can against individuals, but mostly against groups. Groups that have a perhaps messy democratic base. So I just think it's a big conceptual mistake to say that white supremacy. So why do people do it? I think they want more clout in what they say. And self-righteous whites who suddenly realize they have privilege have a tendency to look for big language. No, white privilege is subtle and it's everywhere and it runs deep. And it can be found in the gentlest of people. So I don't think that grandstanding with a big phrase, white supremacy, which implies intention, is wise if you're trying to describe most white people. Now, this gentle oblivion of white skin privilege does build itself into structures that are obstructive for the advancement of people of color. That's true. But these structures do not try to kill you. White supremacy tries to kill its enemies. That's all I really wanted to say. About it, now I will divert just a minute, John, because you did on the subject of colonialism. I was very close to the Governor General of the Philippines. When he was an old man, I was his social hostess. I entertained his friends from the Philippines on his island off Cape Cod called Nashan. And in this house with 52 rooms, we had many, many men who'd been with him in the Philippines. Now, they felt that they were doing God's work in helping childish Filipino people to organize themselves. They fit the image of the colonialist as greedy, not needy, greedy. They liked the free labor, almost free. They liked the resources. They liked the range, 5,000 islands. Who wouldn't want 5,000 islands? The man I worked for, Governor General William Cameron Forbes, his favorite poet was Kipling. And he agreed Kipling had written a great poem when he said, "Take up the white man's burden." He saw himself as doing what was right for the unwashed Filipinos. And when I was entertained quite generously by matrons in the Philippines in the 1980s and 90s, I once said to a group of women holding a big dinner party, "Why are you so nice to me?" "Because I'm American." And a little group of them went away and discussed and came back and said, "We like you because you're better than the Spanish were."
Whoa.
Just a matter of degree. But it is true that Forbes patronized these people as childish and did all kinds of things he thought would help them. And he was proudest of having installed Horace Mann's version of education, universal free public education for all boys and girls. That's the only country in the Asia that has such a policy. So he was proud of that, and also putting the police on the same set of laws throughout the islands. He was proud of that. But it was about control, and I think at heart it was about greed. Now, I don't see it was about some white neediness that you brought into the language of this discussion. at the last minute, and without warning. So I feel incompetent to talk about it, but I do feel that the museum was daring and bold and relevant and caring to create this series. And I'm very glad I was included in it.
And we're grateful that you joined us this evening for sure. Cornell, I believe you had something you wanted to add before we get into solutions.
Yeah, well, I'll just say briefly, I was really just struck by Peggy's comment about white privilege being dangerous for democracy. And so as a civil rights lawyer, one of the things I think about is that the threats to white privilege, precipitating actions that are dangerous to democracy, dangerous and obvious, right? So in other words, the fact that if you're white in this country, you inherit the franchise, the right to vote, unencumbered in the main. And the shrinking number of white people in this country relative to immigrants, relative to people of color, has precipitated if not precipitated, certainly served as inspiration for people to suppress the vote, right? In other words, 33 voter suppressive changes by 19 states since October. So the point being here is that while white privilege is implicit, white supremacy explicit and violent, there is, seems to me as a civil rights lawyer, relationship between the two. When we see the culture wars, right, we see the backlash against the myth of critical race theory in elementary schools, and the fact that we have Black teachers, Black literature, Black philosophy, Black history being demonized and weaponized, and see principals and Black teachers literally having their jobs threatened. So my point being is it seems to me as a civil rights lawyer, there's an interaction between these two in ways that are very tangible, right?
Yes,
I'm sorry.
I quite agree with that. I think that white privilege, the system, is dangerous to democracy, but so is white supremacy. They're just dangerous to democracy in different ways. What joins them, for me, is white control, which occurs when people come to see that they're not in a fair system, but they don't want to change.
That is insecurity at its foundation.
That's white control. You come to see you've got white privilege. It doesn't work well. It is not serving everyone. And you decide for a whole variety of reasons you don't want to change it.
That's right.
That's white control. And in my recent chapter that I wrote on white control, that is the link between pretty unaware white privilege and very aware and intentional white supremacy. It's that decision not to change. So what else is there? Well, for all your listeners, you've got a great audience tonight. White engagement. White engagement is doing things, is it with your words and your choices. In my case, it was visiting police department twice in my town to get them to stop harassing young Black teens. In my case, it was also, I wrote a list in my book, which is this book published by Routledge. I wrote a list of 15 ways in which I use my white skin privilege like a bank account, and I can spend it down. But because it's white privilege, it'll keep refilling.
Ooh.
So I will never go bankrupt. Spending down my bank account of white skin privilege. And one of the things I did was organize for the integration of our neighborhood. Why, as a white, arguing for integration, racial integration,
Sure.
I really had nothing to lose. And in my list of things one can do as a white trying to dismantle or weaken white skin privilege, you can learn from those you were taught to look down on through extensive reading. Don't depend on people of color to do all the education. Educate yourself. There's so much to learn from, and then understand how much you've learned from those you were taught to look down on. So I hired and supported people of color, as we all should, and so on and so forth. The list of 15 things I do is just a small list, but any of us can do things with our money, our choices, our time, our commitments.
Those are phenomenal, tangible solutions, and I encourage everyone to get a copy of Peggy's book if you have not yet. It is a seminal work in this area of privilege. And as we think about solutions and recognizing time, I want to just give a brief opportunity. It's a couple of tangible things that our audience can take away in terms of putting this into practice and thinking about, I think, more deeply about how they engage. Nora, I'd love to start with some of the psychological aspects of how do parents, how do people in a power dominant structure help protect against perpetuating these notions of supremacy or privilege?
Well, I'll keep it brief. I'll just say two things. One, research shows that kids really pick up on their parents' attitudes, including their nonverbals. So one thing that parents can do first and foremost is actually just to try to, as much as they can, to become more comfortable around these topics, right? There's a lot of research that suggests that people are anxious having interracial conversations. So leaning into that a little bit and becoming comfortable, putting yourself into tough spots can avoid the type of negative nonverbals that can actually impinge on one's kids. And the second, I think, is actually just having some of those conversations, right? It's still budding research, but there's increasing research that shows that, white parents having conversations with their kids about concepts like structural racism can be quite effective, right? Rather than shying away from those topics because we're worried that they're divisive or our kids aren't ready for it. I mean, the world itself already is exposing them to many of these concepts. So actually, sitting down, having these conversations, explaining some of these concepts, I think can actually help arm children to get a better understanding of the world around them and those structures.
I love that. One of the best quotes I've heard, and it resonates so well in my household, is that if my Black children are old enough to experience racism, then your white children are old enough to learn about it.
Wow.
With that stated, Patience, question for you. And Peggy talked about this in privilege and sort of the hidden nature of it to those in power. How do you make people more aware of it? How can they become more conscious of something that was designed to be hidden from them? And I'll ask Patience that question, and Peggy, if you want to weigh in as well, please.
All right. Well, I think part of it is re-examining how we interact as people with privilege, right? And instead of looking at it as this pyramid, looking at it in some ways as a circle, so that we're each interrogating sort of, where do I have some privilege? Because I think there's a personal and interpersonal aspect to this, and then there's a systemic aspect. And unless I'm perfectly aware about where I'm positioned within that system, then it's really hard for me to advance changes. And it doesn't position whiteness as the ultimate top of that hierarchy that one might have to strive towards, but that we can look at other privileges that we have. Because one thing I say really quickly is sometimes I'll say, if I look at my identities as a Black woman and then add immigrant to that, I can say life sucks, good night, right? Or I could step back and think about what are some other ways. And really quickly, because Cornell, you mentioned childhood education and even Peggy. So I have a 5-year-old, and at his daycare, up until last year, they would have us sign this document that was supposed to be connected to the state. And so it was very uneasy for me. It was titled Aggressive Behavior Policy. And I'm like, how do you have an aggressive behavior policy for a 10-month-old, for a 1-month-old, for a 4 or 5 years old? And so I pushed back and I asked for meetings with the regional managers of the center. And in that conversation, they were like, no, we would never do that to your child. And, trying to reassure. And what I said was, I am entering this conversation from a place of privilege. I'm not so concerned about my son as I am concerned about another Black boy who looks like him. Because you're telling me this is not going to go anywhere, but you're documenting it in a statewide system. I know that this is going to be different for kids who look like him and him than it is for white kids. And so what is it that we can do so that this is no longer a thing? And again, it's not about just him. It's about all the other kids who look like him. So looking at the ways in which we can use our voice, leverage our privilege, I had examined the areas in which I had some privilege that I could articulate that to this person to a point where they could come around and then say, all right, let's work on this, right? Whereas if I was just hyper-focused on the self, we wouldn't have gotten to that systemic piece.
I appreciate that. And Peggy, I want to sort of dovetail off of this, but in addition to becoming aware of something that was designed to be hidden, how do you, for those who have reconciled with it, have really examined it, how do you encourage them, or what would you have them do to release this need to control, right? And how can they use that privilege for good? So maybe two quick tips or 3 quick tips, if you could.
Once you humble yourself to learn from those you were taught to look down on, first to admit that there are those you were taught to look down on. And a good way of testing that is, would your parents have been comfortable with anyone you wanted to marry? And in most cases, the answer is no. Even for those who think I was taught to look down on nobody. But if you humble yourself to learn from those you were taught to look down on, your life gets in, I'll speak for myself, it was transformative. For me to no longer be afraid to talk to people of color, to be sought out by people of color who wanted to talk, to read, watch, get to know the men in the color of fear, which is one of the great testimonies from a circle of men of color on what their racial experience has been in the United States. It was wonderful to stop being hated. It was so wonderful not to be hated or resented anymore.
That sounds like a great incentive for those in privilege. That sounds like a phenomenal incentive for those in privileged positions. With that, Peggy, we're being notified. I'm being notified that we're close to time, so I'm going to keep moving real quick. And Cornell, I want to give you the last word before we wrap. But after all of this conversation, which I know we could have gone at least 5 hours deep, whose job is it to dismantle systemic racism, supremacy, and privilege?
So I'll simply say this. The formal job description belongs to white people.
Okay.
But the default job responsibility must be those who bear the brunt of oppression. What I mean by that is W.E.B. Du Bois said, if you're in a race and you're behind, you have no other choice but to run faster to get ahead. Okay. And by way of what practical solutions, I want to suggest just a couple of things. We talked about white privilege. We talked about white supremacy. I think we have to talk about an end on empowerment, right? And we can empower ourselves by being good advocates for ourselves, good advocates for our communities. And that means studying advocacy, studying power, right? It's not about what other people do to us. It's about what we do for ourselves. And we can study that, get better at it, and as a consequence, move ourselves closer to the finish line.
Perfect way to wrap this up. I want to thank each of our panelists, our esteemed panelists this evening, for contributing not only time, but wisdom, energy, and intent behind this oftentimes uncomfortable conversation around race. I want to also thank, once again, the Newark Museum of Art for taking a bold and brave step forward to open up the lines of dialogue in hopes that we can move closer to the ultimate goals of equity and inclusion and diversity. So with that, thank you to the audience. We appreciate you tuning in. We wish you well, be safe, and good night.